Hi everyone, and welcome to CIH's podcast. We're looking today at learning across the UK and Ireland from damp and mould. So we're going to have a conversation today looking at damp and mould issues. Joining me today we have Dr. Eve Blezard, who is Policy Lead for Housing Quality here at the Chartered Institute of Housing. We have Andy Sutton, who is co-founder of Sero, who helps social landlords to retrofit homes, leveraging funds and making sure that benefit can be shared between residents and providers. Last but not least, we have Cassidy, who's CEO of Housing Links, which is a multidisciplinary support service organisation in Ireland, leading on asset management and contracting to the housing and care sectors, and they run right across Ireland. So we're looking for a cross-jurisdictional conversation today. We recognise that laws and policies differ, but good practice is largely the same. So we hope to have a good conversation today. I'm your host. I'm Justin Cartwright, the National Director for Northern Ireland at the Chartered Institute of Housing. But I was also co-author of a good practice guide on damp and mould, which is called Maintaining Healthy Homes, a Guide to Preventing and Resolving Damp and Mould. So that's a document that we did jointly with NIFA, the Northern Ireland Federation of Housing Associations locally, and there's some good resources attached to that as well, like an informational video on preventing condensation in the home, as well as a flyer for residents. So all that said, as I said, we've got a brilliant panel of guests today. So we might kick off the conversation because as I touched on there, so looking across the UK and Ireland, we're seeing a heightened focus on the quality of homes. So while you have specific regulations like AWAB's law, obviously is a major one in England. Elsewhere, we're looking at updated social housing quality standards of varying descriptions. So while these approaches vary, really the underlying professional expectation and the kind of homes and experiences that we want residents to have in their communities, those expectations are the same. So just to throw it open, I'm interested in hearing from guests on, how are these evolving legal and ethical standards changing the way your organisations prioritise damp and mould, or the organisations that you work with at a board and leadership level, but then practically as well. So how's the changing legal and policy landscape shaping things, do you think?
Happy to come in there, Justin, to kick it off. And I think from my perspective, I think across the UK and Ireland, I think the general high level concept is that landlords should be adopting a zero tolerance approach to damp and mold. I think that's the starter for 10 really. And I think from an Irish context, how do you do that? And that's really around policy and culture. And I think we need to be sort of moving away from the reactive to the proactive, and almost from a cultural piece, moving away from blame to responsibility. And I think that's going to be key for social landlords as they consider the implications of damp and mold. And I guess the tragedy surrounding AWAB's law has sort of accelerated that. And from an Irish context, it has arrived. It's here. It's here to stay. It was always en route. And I think from an Irish context, within the housing sector, AHBs need to consider how they approach damp and mold within their own ability to deal with things like asset management and response repair. And the scale of the organisations will be very different, and therefore the approaches may be very different. But I think as a baseline, AHBs should be considering policy, and I think that the cultural piece is going to be key. And when they sit down to think and consider about policy, what does that look like? And I think it's a symbiotic relationship, isn't it, between the actual AHB and the tenant, because it's a mutual piece. We can talk about asset management, we can talk about how our properties are put together, but we also need to have that relationship with the resident in terms of how they live in the home and how they actually understand their own responsibility, I guess, in making sure that they have a safe home. From the AHB point of view, how do you approach the development of a policy around damp and mold? And I guess it's around commitment, isn't it? It's committing to be able to advise customers in terms of how to live in their home. That commitment around providing training to staff to make sure that we have broad competency and qualification. The space around carrying out inspections. No, I guess it's really around that approach from the AHB side. I think that one of the key things that I've seen, and it's around treating the root cause of the issues, when it comes to damp and mold, and not just the symptom. I think there's a really good example when I'm trying to explain that concept to lay people. So the resident brings in and reports a damp and mold issue, and perhaps it's the ceiling over my shower is black and it's all mold. The reaction is send out an operative with a can of mold spray and a J-cloth, clean it down, job done. So the question therein lies, has the AHB responded to the damp and mold issue? And I think partially yes. But again, there are many ways of viewing that. How did the mold arrive in the first place? So is there an extract fan? If there isn't, should there be one? Is there a permanent wall vent? Has it been blocked? If there is an extract fan, has it got an overrun time? Has it got capacity to deal with the moisture? Has it been connected into the attic space? Is it connected into the attic space and there's insulation line across it? So a multitude of questions, and I think we need to be focusing really on the root causes as opposed just to the superficial treatment of symptoms. I think the key thing then around that is how as an organisation we record and evidence that. I think that's going to be key. So some thoughts there, Justin, just to bring some light from my concept.
We'll bring in Andy then. So thanks for that, Derek. So Andy, keen to hear your thoughts. I suppose more practically, as Derek mentions there has been a significant shift away from blaming resident lifestyle. Of course, damp and mold result from that kind of complex interplay between the person and the home. But at the same time, this kind of catch-all approach to lifestyle is being moved away from, focus on much more getting to the root cause of the issue. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I very much agree with that point, and I think so. Firstly, I'll apologise to our Celtic cousins. I'm sat in Wales, but much of Sero's work is England and Wales, so I'm not as up to speed on the Irish requirements as necessary. But I think we are moving in the positive direction towards addressing the issues of damp and mould, but I don't think we're fully there yet. There are some good examples of social landlords and perhaps to a lesser extent private landlords that are tackling this issue, but I think there are also examples at the other end where people are just responding to the symptoms, not tackling the cause, as you've alluded to. I also don't think that sectorally we've really recognised that there is an endemic problem in here. So, as I approach these things from the perspective of a design flaw, really. And the challenge for me here is, and I guess I inevitably do as a chartered architect, but the challenge for me is actually there is a fundamental gap in our requirements. We are building or retrofitting homes, and for English social landlords, their grant funding is tied to PAS 2035. PAS 2035 requires an occupancy assessment of the home. That's potentially a snapshot on the day. There is a much clearer requirement in the bedroom standard where they are allocating homes to the numbers of occupants. And if you run through the bedroom standard, what you see is a very different predicted occupancy to that which you'd get if you ran the backstop assumptions in Part F. So for every retrofit or every new build, we are building in almost inevitably damp and mold, because we are not actually setting a client brief for retrofit or new build that makes a correct assumption or a far more likely assumption for the number of people in that home. What that means is that the four factors that will drive the damp and mold, so the surface temperature, the moisture generation, which is driven by the activities in the home, the ventilation required to take that moisture out, and the fabric performance that will treat that internal temperature, and then whether the residents can afford to run their home at an affordable price. We effectively bake in at design brief stage the failure of that building. And then what we've seen, and the Ombudsman has called out quite rightly, that we had a historically, perhaps I think the Ombudsman called it systemic blaming of lifestyle. Well, that's not lifestyle. That's a briefing failure. We were not recognizing the way that people were living in these homes, and then secondarily, we were not advising the people how that home was designed to be operated, I should say. So we're not telling them how to live. We're telling them how that home is designed to be occupied, in the same way that you might tell someone the designed performance of driving a car or how you use a kettle or whatever. And those factors still aren't there. So we do need to be putting in proper briefings for retrofits and for new builds to anticipate the occupation, specifically in social housing, where I think over-occupation is 8 times more likely than in owner-occupied homes, which is what the regulations are designed on owner-occupied homes. Social landlords need to recognise that is not their occupancy requirement. They should know their residents better than regulatory standards. They should be looking at what that resident likely behaviours are, designing around those likely behaviours and embedding that into their brief, and then holding their technical teams to account to ensure it's delivered. And I think from that point of view, you can get to a point where you're designing out damp and mould rather than running around, as Derek rightly said, painting some god-awful thing on an area which is just treating a symptom that'll come back because the conditions remain.
That's a really fascinating insight there, Andy. I'll bring in Eve at this point, because Eve, just to remind listeners, is CIH's policy lead for housing quality. And Andy very ably there outlined the interplay between housing quality, design standards, and the relationship with damp, condensation, mold growth, etc. So just keen to hear your insights on that from a kind of design and quality perspective.
Yeah, and I think for us it's about, I think Andy touched about it there, about the interpretation of maybe regulation and policy, but also being prepared to look at that against your own stock and knowing what makes sense about your own stock. And I think that not just at a board level, but right through the organisation, being able to, I was going to say demonstrate, but I think understand that the scale of issues in across the stock, rather than are we ready to respond when things go wrong, if that sort of makes sense. So maybe that shift in reactive to proactive is where we'd expect people to be. And I think that when you look at the new decent homes standard that's coming in for England, I think it's about that, and I've been talking about this week, and then when you look at like regulatory judgments and gradings, being clear that they're actually a baseline, and an important baseline, but not really designed to be the end point or the ultimate achievement or the whole system in terms of improving housing conditions. That's the baseline that we should be at. So I think the shift is a little bit for me that there is a focus on OAB's law, but that should be a legal backstop, if that makes sense, so that yes, we've got those timescales and we've got that legal liability and that sort of accountability that residents are looking at, but that really that's there for when things have gone wrong, if you will, from my point of view, that the other policy and the regulation that sits before that, and also there is maybe an ethical expectation that kind of predates that as a law, but I think maybe that we have seen a bit of a shift in accountability and being clear about what your data tells you, and also just going back to the lifestyle issue, moving away from those really oversimplified explanations. And I thought Andy's points were really interesting in terms of design and how homes are supposed to be. And I think also in overcrowding, that would not be that household's fault. So I think when you're going into a property and a household or a family has had to make do, if you will, has had to navigate what they actually need in their household and life against the property that they're in, and just really removing some of the judgment and the blame that comes out of that, and really starting to explore building condition and environmental factors and why have people had to live like that in their home, rather than that risk of that we default too quickly to a single explanation without sort of fully understanding. Yeah, so I don't know whether I touched on design a lot there. It was probably more coming from that sort of decency, but yeah, but just being open to the fact that decent homes and regulatory gradings around decency and quality are designed to be a baseline, and how do we sort of really push beyond that and understand what people need and want in terms of the homes that they live in.
Even just staying with yourself, Eve, even recognizing that, decent home standard and their various national equivalents, are a baseline, if you like. Recognizing that, do you think, though, that those frameworks are actually equipped to drive the systemic change that's needed, or are there still significant gaps when it comes to baseline regulations?
I think just having a look between the different devolved nations' interpretation of decent homes. So if I have a look at the English version, and I don't think it was ever designed to be like a whole system for improving housing conditions, and I think about maybe where I have come from in a very holistic and health and well-being approach, and then you look at the Welsh sort of approach and standards to decency, how there is a lot more around well-being built into that, and just the differences between those two. Yeah, and I think you've got to be clear on compliance and regulation, and then where you feel ethically and morally you should be for your residents and what they need. And I think that goes back to Andy's point about that difference between, I can interpret what this policy or what this legislation or what this compliance does look like on a national scale, but in reality my data and my engagement should tell me what my residents are living with and need, and trying to be able to flex, which is really very simplistic answer when I've not even touched on the range of financial pressures and funding, but yeah, I think that I don't think they were designed. I don't think they're designed to be everything, and how about we look at maybe using them a bit more proactively rather than a sort of endpoint compliance framework.
Andy, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, very much agree. I think that they're a backstop, and as a proud Welshman, I'm proud that WHQS does a pretty good job and even includes carpets. But let's not get controversial. But I think this, to me, comes back to the response times and things that are set out in AWABs and similarly elsewhere with the hazard rule for WHQS, are about responding and giving a reasonable service ultimately to the residents in the homes, but they're not about getting ahead of the problem. So you'll be trapped in this response loop if you're not actually addressing the cause, not the symptom. And this, for me, comes back to the holistic view of the home. You need to assess a home overall, and that includes the occupancy and a realistic assessment of the occupancy, but it also includes the energy performance of the home. If you have, for example, a home which is still on oil for some reason, and hopefully migrating away very quickly, but that resident may well therefore be facing much higher energy bills. So as a landlord, you should probably be assuming that their capacity to heat that property is lower. And as a consequence, you can reasonably assume, and I think a court would probably reasonably say, well, if you're expecting them to pay a high fuel bill, they're going to use less fuel, which likely means your internal surfaces will be cooler, which means you have an increased risk of damp and mould in that, because it's one of the key driving factors that trigger it. So I think it's back to this holistic view, assessing the home. If you aren't bringing the fuel bill down now, and we can't upgrade all homes simultaneously right away, there's challenges around how much that costs and how much we can do, and supply chain and all these things that we know, then we need to be making realistic assessments about the risk of damp and mould because of the cost of heating, as well as ventilation challenges, which are, as I said in the first point, they're not covered well enough. And there is frankly a frustratingly simple fix to this, which is assume the right occupancy, design for that maximum occupancy, and then fit one of, I think, probably 3 routes to tune that ventilation down to the actual occupancy as the resident moves in. Make it part of your void process to retune the ventilation. Having designed it to maximum occupancy, you can tune it down if needs be, if you're under occupying their home, which is of course fairly unlikely.
Thanks, Andy. I'll bring Derek in a second just to get some further thoughts on being proactive, but I thought at this stage I should go back to the CAH Good Practice Guide on damp and mould that I mentioned. Some really excellent case studies in there from a whole range really of social landlords with various housing ages and things like that, which is important. I remember one landlord I think most of their homes are built from the 90s and onwards, so relatively, good quality. So when they're looking at damp and mold issues, it's a different conversation to looking at a home that might have solid brick or stone construction and the issues that arise from that. But I thought a really good example in there about being proactive was that they'd received a complaint about some damp and mold in an apartment block in particular. So they went out and investigated it, found a certain kind of property-specific things, but then started looking proactively at apartment blocks of similar construction type and age in the area, and actually going out there and proactively looking at these homes. They found a lot of the kind of condensation was arising from just the typical stuff, bathing, cooking, etc. Variable use of extractor fans. I think in a couple of cases there might have been cold spots arising from some insulation being moved in the roof. Part of their approach was installing drying racks, clotheslines outside. There's a space to do that, but then installing cover over those as well, just recognizing that the Northern Irish weather in particular is, consistently unreliable. So there was that option, but then there was sort of working with the resident, a bit of education around amounts of condensation, amounts of humidity in the home, condensation, to make sure that the extractor fan is being used, wherever possible. If you can't use the rack outside, you can put it on a rack in the bathroom with the door closed, running the extractor fan, while recognizing, of course, that while the clothes will still dry, they'll, dry more slowly. So you need to be kind of recognizing family and, how reliable that would be. But I just thought that was a really good example of being proactive and, as you say, not just going out there and treating the kind of damp and mold and walking away and expecting that will be the end of it. So coming back to Derek, I'd be really interested to hear your further thoughts on how you can see being more proactive in not just resolving but preventing damp and mold in the first place, and making sure that residents, never have to make that first call.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, sort of echoing the sentiments of my colleagues, I think it's very much around that consistency of approach. And I think that there's certainly a challenge here from an Irish context anyway, that AHBs are going to be sitting down, they're developing out their policies, developing out their processes, developing out their IT systems. And I guess you're sitting down and then all of a sudden you realize that you may need 3 to 4 qualified surveyors to help roll out your damp and mold service and your policy. And the rhetorical question here, I don't know if anyone's tried to recruit 3 or 4 surveyors at the moment. It's nigh on impossible. So that leaves you with the question is, do you put your damp and mold approach on hold? And I think obviously we have to say no. But how do organizations look at themselves inwardly and see, how do we address the competencies? How do we address the expertise needed to support ourselves in providing decent homes, habitable homes for residents? And how do we ensure that the residents know how to deal with the homes and deal with things like damp and mold? And I guess it's really around making sure every visit counts, or every touch point counts, because from an organization perspective, your resident or your tenant is going to ring in a repair. You're going to have a contractor or an operative ring the doorbell. You're going to have a housing officer on site. You're going to have a scheme warden on site. You're going to have a caretaker on site. How do we imbue that consistency of the organization's key driver around policy down and cascade that through the organization? So we want the repairs operative almost singing the same tune as the customer service advisor that's taking the call around the damp and mold piece. So I know technology is going to have a huge impact, but again, we have to look at different organizations in terms of their scale and their size at the moment. So I think it's very much around having to have that realistic conversation at an organization level in terms of damp and mold, no different than your repairs, your asset management strategy. What, as an organization of our scale, can we do to put in place procedures that ensure that we can support our residents and support our home delivery to make sure that we're mitigating damp and mold? And I do think there's a lot around education, looking at our key touch points. How do we foresee the damp and mold report coming in, or the repair coming in from the residents, and how our key touch points throughout the organization respond to that? And I think it's really around consistency of approach. So if a resident chooses to ring in, that our customer service advisor has a series of questions or a series of understanding at that level to be able to deal with that and triage. No different than our housing officer who's ringing the doorbell to have a conversation about tenant queries, that if they're hit with a damp and mold query, that they are well equipped to be able to deal with that. So leaving no stone unturned and leaving no opportunity, because I think ultimately from the housing association's perspective, it's that overarching question of how do we harvest information at each key touch point, and how do we impart information at each key touch point, and making sure that it aligns with our overall concept. Because I think from a resident's perspective, they want to live in a comfortable home. So how do we support them to do that? And it's really around that symbiotic relationship between both sides of the policy. And I do think that that's going to be something that housing associations do need to consider as they start to focus a bit more on damp and mold as a policy and a procedure, because it's easy to glean one from another organization, but is that particular policy fit for purpose for your organization? I think that's going to be key. And I think it's very much setting ourselves up to succeed, to make sure that as an organization we're providing the right route and the right vehicle for our residents to be able to access good information on damp and mold, and again equip our staff and equip our organization to be able to deal with it as well. As I said on the intro, it's very much here to stay, but it's very much around how as an organization we set ourselves up to do that. And again, leading back into the question of harvesting information, I think there are great opportunities as we roll out stock condition surveys throughout our building investment planning, to start thinking about how we glean information that might support the damp and mold question as well. So again, starting to record more information around ventilation, openings in the structure, what type of insulation we have in place. So again, there's a lot of inconsistency at the moment in terms of how organizations gather stock condition survey data, and I think having some guidance at an organization level to support the asset management teams collect the information that again will support the damp and mold policy and procedure, I think will be key as well. So I think there's a lot that we can do, but I do think certainly from an Irish setting, there's such a broad range of size and shape to organizations that constitute approved housing bodies that we really do need to target and focus at an organization level.
I mean, I very much agree with Derek's point, and I was going to pick up on the point about engaging with the residents particularly. I think the challenges of getting surveyors and things is absolutely fair. One of the things I challenge a social landlord to look at is actually the first step isn't necessarily to get the surveyors out there doing things, although obviously if you can parallel track things, that's useful. But really it's understanding the residents, your own residents, and making sure that your brief is as clear and accurate to what they are likely to be doing as possible. So that's a key starting point from data analysts, from the resident teams, understanding how people live in the homes that the social landlord owns. But the point I wanted to pick up on was really communicating that to the residents. If you're not communicating, and the Ombudsman was quite clear about this, there's a contractual point about putting it into tenancy agreements, but there's a much more practical point about actually telling the residents that we assume you will dry clothes on a rack in the bathroom. We assume that you will boil pans with lids on. Or don't assume that if the evidence suggests that actually nobody does that and they boil pans without lids on. Either way is fine, so long as you're communicating it to the resident, and then in the other direction, you're communicating it to the technical design team to say that actually the assumption here has to be that the lid isn't on the pan when it's boiling, and that they boil a pan 3 times a day because they have a preference to cook more or whatever it may be, and therefore the design has to cope with that. And then you can be starting to plug into the design side of things, as would be required by PAS 2035 in effect, not so clearly under Part F in England and Wales, in England, sorry. But that requirement to assess the occupancy and therefore the moisture load more accurately and design a system to suit it. And then you can take an MVHR route if you want to be bells and whistles, or you can pick up a humidity sensitive ventilation extract system, which will then vary according to that maximum but bring it down when it doesn't need to, or do something fixed flow with a DMEV and adjustable trickle vents, which I suspect is less reliable. So the middle of those is probably the right route. But the answer to this, to stop having an endless cycle of reactive response, is to get ahead of it, understand your residents realistically. If you're providing outdoor drying areas, are they year round, as you rightly said, Justin? And is that realistically going to get traction with residents? And if you're not providing that, then you need to make sensible assumptions that they are going to live in these homes. They're going to wash clothes, they're going to wash themselves, they're going to cook. You know the demographics of your own tenants, so make a realistic assessment of that. That should lead you to a moisture load which is a predictable level based on occupancy, and that occupancy should probably be based on bedroom allocation that you're likely to do through the bedroom standard rather than through regulatory minimums, because they're not representative of social housing. Once you've brought all that together, you actually have quite a quick and implementable mechanism to work through your housing stock at whatever rate you can afford, and not then realistically expect to have to go back to them to deal with reactive issues anywhere near as often, because you'll be dealing with the exceptions, not the hardwired problem, which is what we've got at the moment.
I think design based on use doesn't sound awfully radical when you put it that way. Just before we wrap up, I just wanted to bring in Eve for some final thoughts on that communication, because I think absolutely learning from residents, knowing your own profile, using what data you have to inform your response is key. But if we focus on the professionalism of staff, so how can frontline teams ensure that they're leading not just with, I suppose, technical awareness, but with empathy and professional curiosity during their interactions with people?
Yeah, professional curiosity is exactly the term I had written in my notes. Yeah, I did see a really interesting case study at a conference a few months ago. Peabody were recruiting to their team that would primarily be looking at damp and mould, but you know, a lot of different hazards that would have been coming through. And they made a decision for that sort of initial team that would be looking at those inquiries not to go for, in their recruitment process, looking at lots of technical specifications or lots of housing specific experience. They went with looking at people that could demonstrate that they had that professional curiosity, that they'd worked where they had empathy and they had strong sort of communication and engagement skills, and that was what they went with. And it followed a really interesting presentation where they showed a property, photographs of a property that had got damp and mould, and talked a little bit about how the resident had been living in that property. And one of the things was that the ventilation fan had been switched off or blocked because the resident was finding that noisy, and different things in the home. And there were lots of nods of people sort of, you know, agreeing that they recognise that situation, and then the repairs director said, "I'd just like to let you know that that's my mum's house, that's my mum's property. That's not actually a property from one of our customers," and she was experiencing it in that. And I could see that there were things that within how she wanted to live in her household might not have been necessarily helpful in terms of bringing the moisture level down, but it was how she needed to live in her home, and it was about having questions about why that was so. I think sometimes it's about how you approach those conversations, and and avoiding those assumptions, and being really open to what residents are telling you. So yeah, I think that was a really interesting take on that, in terms of let's go with an empathy first sort of approach, not just to our recruitment, but how that team is then going to work. And I think it's maybe recognizing that if you have got residents that have had an issue for quite some time, they could easily be quite frustrated, exhausted, embarrassed, angry. There's a lot of different things that could be going on there, and there could be a lot of trust that's broken down. So I think then it's about, how do you have a conversation about what's happening and what's going to happen in sort of, honest and clear sort of language, and making sure you've got sort of proper sort of follow through and transparency about what's happening, particularly if that sort of trust has broken down. And also that those initial conversations may be difficult if that resident has experienced that kind of satisfaction, or has been kind of worn down, if you will, living with an issue for some time. And there might need to be that sort of empathy-based communication work that goes on before you get to the technical side of how you resolve the hazard, and just being prepared to work with rather than to, I suppose, would be a bit of insight into that, because I think damp and mould in particular can often be kind of a key sort of flashpoint for broken trust.
I think that's a really powerful point to end on, because ultimately it's the people, our people that live in the homes, and it's their quality of life that's impacted, and we want to create a system and people supporting residents where they can live well in their communities. So I just wanted to thank all of our guests on today's podcast. Eve, Andy, Derek, you've all been brilliant. Thank you to our listeners, and tune in to our next podcast, which you can find on the CIH website or on our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening.